Have you ever had that feeling that you are being watched? As if someone knows more about you than you do? That was my first thought when I decided to share my story. My name? Well, you can call me Alex. It's not my real name, of course. If it were, you would understand why it is impossible to use it. I lived an experience that should never be revealed. Something so deep and disturbing that I still wake up in the middle of the night in a cold sweat, certain that they are coming after me. Before we start, turn off the lights, grab your headphones, and click subscribe to support the channel. That way, you don't miss any of our stories. Now let me take you to the beginning, to before everything changes. I was never the kind of person who believed in conspiracy theories or anything beyond what the eye could see. I was always logical, almost cold. I grew up in a small town, far from the glamour and chaos of the big metropolises. My childhood was simple: school, friends, family. As an adult, I plunged headlong into a career that consumed me. Stress, sleepless nights, and a constant feeling that something was missing. It was this gap, this void that seemed impossible to fill, that opened the door to everything that was to come. I wasn't looking for spiritual answers. In fact, I didn't even know what I was looking for. But when I saw that illuminated sign on a busy avenue, something attracted me. Scientology, discover your true potential. I laughed. It was just another one of those empty promises, right? Little did I know that that innocent moment would change my life forever. At first, I had no idea what Scientology really was. For me, it was just another one of those spiritual fashions that promised miracles in exchange for money. However, there was something about the way this place shone at night, almost like a lighthouse in the darkness. I remember standing in front of the entrance, hesitant. Inside, the reception was welcoming, almost too warm. A man with an impeccable smile greeted me, as if he already knew me. "Welcome. You came at the right time," he said, handing me a brochure. The booklet promised something that seemed impossible: answers to the deepest questions in my life, a method for reaching my true potential, and most of all, the promise of control. Control over myself, my fears, my uncertainties. What attracted me? The truth is that I was lost. And somehow, they knew it before I even opened my mouth. As if my every gesture, every hesitation, was an open book to them. That's when they mentioned the personality test. "It's free," they said. "It will help you understand more about yourself." And before I could say no, I was already sitting in a small room with a paper in front of me. The first few minutes were easy. Simple, generic questions. But as I progressed, it felt like the test was stripping me off, piece by piece, until nothing was left but a raw, vulnerable version of myself. And then came the analysis, the first of many manipulations. After the personality test, I was taken to another room. The woman guiding me didn't say much, but her constant smile was almost disconcerting. As we walked down that spotless white hallway, my mind was trying to process what had just happened. The man who reviewed my test had a calm tone, but his words seemed handpicked to disarm me. "You carry a burden, Alex," he said, leaning forward slightly. "A lot of anxiety, frustration, but that could change. You're in the right place to work it out." That moved me. How did he know? He didn't even know me. But the truth is that he was right. I carried a constant restlessness, a void that seemed impossible to fill. The woman opened a door and invited me into another room. It was spacious, with chairs arranged in rows in front of a large screen. There were other people there, each as still as I felt inside. A video began. The background music was quiet, almost hypnotic, while scenes of people smiling and living seemingly perfect lives flashed across the screen. "Scientology," said the soft voice of the narration, "is not a religion like any other. It is a science of the mind, a path to clarity and freedom." Every word seemed designed to hit me hard. Freedom? Clarity? It was all I was looking for, even without admitting it out loud. When the video ended, the woman came back and sat next to me. "What do you think?" she asked, with a smile that seemed to know my answer before I even spoke. "Interesting," I replied, trying to remain neutral. But she didn't seem to mind my hesitation. "Are you ready to take the next step?" It was a simple question, but loaded with weight. Deep down, I knew something was different. My mind was torn between curiosity and a strange discomfort. But before I could refuse, she presented me with a booklet. "This is the introductory course. Only $50, a symbolic amount for a future that can be transformed." I should have refused. Any sensible person would have refused. But as I held that paper, my mind went back to the words of the man who reviewed my test. "You're in the right place to solve this." And there at that moment I believed. For the first time, I felt that maybe someone had the answers I needed. So, I signed the paper. The signature on paper seemed to seal something deeper than a simple financial commitment. The next morning, I was called back to the main building. The place looked even more intimidating in daylight. The shadows had disappeared, but the coldness of the white corridors was almost suffocating. They took me to a smaller room, equipped with a simple table and a quirky device that they explained to me was an e-meter. It looked like something out of a science fiction movie. 2 cylinders connected to a machine that promised to measure electrodermal responses. "Let's start with a simple procedure," they said. I was instructed to hold the cylinders while the evaluator, a slow-spoken man with a piercing gaze, asked me seemingly harmless questions. "How do you feel about your job? And your family?" At first, I answered vaguely, but with each answer, he made quick notes and watched the e-meter pointer carefully. "It looks like you're holding something," he said, without taking his eyes off the machine. "A memory, maybe a trauma." The questions began to become more personal, more incisive. And before I knew it, I was revealing things that I rarely admitted even to myself. The e-meter was just a tool, but the way it reacted to my answers made me feel exposed, vulnerable. When we finished, the evaluator looked at me with a mixture of compassion and authority. "You're carrying weights you don't even know exist," he said. "But we can help you release it. This is only the beginning of the purification process." Those words, spoken with such certainty, moved me. He seemed to understand my mind in a way that I myself couldn't. It was scary and fascinating at the same time. After the session, I was taken to another room where there were more people who were also holding the e-meter cylinders. There were whispers, lost looks. Some seemed relieved, others simply tired. When I left the building that day, the world outside seemed strangely distant. A sense of disconnection enveloped me, as if I had stepped into something I didn't know how to get out of. But at the same time, there was a promise of answers, of clarity. I wanted to believe that I was on the right track. I just didn't know I was being taken to a much darker place than I could have imagined. After the session with the e-meter, I left the building with my head spinning. The evaluator's words about releasing the weights and purifying kept popping into my mind. It was as if he had planted a seed, something I couldn't ignore. And the next day, that seed began to grow. I returned to the building, now feeling a little more familiar with the corridors and the controlled atmosphere. I was taken to a training room. The instructor greeted me with an enthusiasm that seemed rehearsed. "Welcome to the first step on your path to clarity," he said. In the center of the room was a small group, all sitting in pairs in front of empty tables. "Today, we are going to work on the basis of everything, communication and self-control." He pointed me to a chair in front of a man who appeared to be my age, with sunken eyes and a tired expression. The first task was simple, at least in theory. Look directly into my partner's eyes and stay focused. Without blinking, without looking away, without showing emotion, explained the instructor. The first few minutes were tolerable. In the silence, I could hear my own breathing and the slight oscillation of the e-meter pointer in the next room. But as time passed, something began to happen. My heart beat faster, my mind raced. It was as if my partner's gaze was invading thoughts that I was trying to hide even from myself. When we were finally told to stop, my head was pounding. The instructor smiled. "Very well. This is just the beginning. You faced your first barrier. I thought the session would end there, but the training continued. Now, repeat the same phrases to your partners over and over again, without hesitation," he ordered. The sentences were short and meaningless, but the constant repetition felt like a test of mental endurance. "I am responsible for my life," I repeated dozens of times, until the words lost their meaning. Next to me, a woman began to tremble. The instructor watched her for a moment before approaching and leading her out of the room. When he returned, he acted as if nothing had happened. It was strange, uncomfortable, but also fascinating. There was no room for doubt or criticism. Any hesitation was seen as a fault of his, something that needed to be corrected. And by the end of the training, I was exhausted, but there was something more. A sense that maybe, just maybe, I was really beginning to understand what they called clarity. As I walked out of the room, past other participants who held the e-meter cylinders in their hands, I realized how much I was already involved. They didn't have to force anything. I was giving myself away, but there was something I still didn't understand. Each exercise seemed to take me somewhere, but where exactly? And deep down, why did I keep coming back? The answer, I would realize later, was simple. They were already in control. When I finished another training session, with my mind tired and my body even heavier, I realized that something in me was changing. It wasn't just the physical discomfort. There was something psychological, something that seemed to erode my confidence in who I was before all of this. As I left the room, the instructor who had praised my progress called me back. "Alex, I'd like to introduce you to some people." I was led to a separate area, where other participants were gathered in small groups. But instead of relieving my growing sense of isolation, it only intensified it. The people there were not as I expected. Enigmatic smiles and carefully controlled conversations filled the room. When I tried to start a conversation with a guy who looked younger than me, he just looked at me, as if analyzing whether or not he could answer. "You'll understand in time," he said, in a tone that seemed as much a warning as a promise. The exercises became more and more intense. In one of the sessions, we were instructed to sit face-to-face with our usual partners, but this time, in absolute silence. It was the same initial exercise of facing the other without looking away. But something had changed. The silence, once uncomfortable, now seemed dense, almost suffocating. Every second felt like an invitation for me to search the darkest corners of my mind. And my partner's gaze, that same tired man who had been with me from the beginning, seemed to reflect something I didn't want to face. It was during this session that I realized one thing. There, you were not encouraged to create connections. Friendships were a distraction, something that could weaken the control they had over us. Still, I tried. During a break, I sat next to a woman who seemed as lost as I was. "How's it going for you?" I asked almost in a whisper. She hesitated before answering. "They say I need to trust the process more, that I'm still resisting." Before I could ask any more, an instructor entered the room, and she immediately stood up, as if the simple act of talking to me was a transgression. At that moment, something became clear. There, trusting someone was dangerous. Everyone was being watched closely, and any sign of hesitation or doubt could be interpreted as weakness. This realization hit me like a punch in the stomach. Human relationships, which had once seemed so natural, were now treated as threats to the system they were creating within me. Each person there was, at the same time, a victim and a potential whistleblower. And all the while, my sense of isolation grew. I was surrounded by people, but I never felt so alone. I began to question why I was still there. But whenever this thought came up, the words of the instructors echoed in my mind. "You are on the right track. We're here to help you." And the worst? A part of me believed that, after weeks in training, something started to change. Sessions that were once filled with seemingly harmless exercises began to take on a different tone. It was not only what they said, but how they said it. Words like progress, clarity, and commitment appeared more and more frequently, loaded with a weight they did not have before. One afternoon, as I was leaving one of the training rooms, I was approached by one of the instructors. He had that same impeccable smile, but this time there was something more in his eyes. "Alex, we want to talk to you about the next steps in your development," he said, gesturing for me to follow him. I followed him down corridors that never seemed to end, until we came to a door I had never noticed before. It was different from the others, more imposing, with a discreet sign that read, "Restricted Area." He opened it, and I hesitated for a moment before entering. The room was smaller than I had imagined, with walls lined with files and shelves full of folders organized by codes I didn't recognize. In the center, a simple table where a man was sitting. He looked older than the others, but he had the same impeccable posture and a presence that seemed to fill the space. "Welcome, Alex," he said, without looking up from the papers in front of him. "You're progressing well. It's time to learn a little bit more about who we are and what we really do here." It was then that he began to talk about the hierarchy of the organization. He explained that what I had experienced so far was just the base, an introduction. There were higher levels, each bringing new knowledge and responsibilities. But reaching these levels requires more than just dedication, he continued. It requires absolute trust. Transparency. The word transparency made me uncomfortable. He talked about how each member had a personal file where their achievements, challenges, and most disturbingly, their weaknesses were recorded. "It's for your good," he said, as if to reassure me. "To make sure we can help you in the best way we can." The discomfort that had been growing inside me intensified. I didn't know what was written in my file, but the idea that they were collecting information about me, without me knowing, made me feel exposed, vulnerable. Before leaving the room, the man handed me a sealed folder. "Here are the next materials for your training. Read carefully. And remember, every step you take is a step toward freedom." I took the briefcase home, but it took hours for me to have the courage to open it. When I finally did, I found a document full of jargon and vague instructions, but with a clear message. I was entering a level where expectations were higher, and the margin for error was non-existent. At that moment, I began to understand how much more this organization was than it seemed. It wasn't just about clarity or personal progress. It was about control, about knowing everything about you, while you knew next to nothing about them. And, for the first time, I wondered if I could still get out of there. After receiving that portfolio, my relationship with the organization changed. It wasn't just a matter of discomfort. It was as if the air around me was thicker, each interaction more loaded with hidden intentions. What once seemed like training now began to resemble a constant test, where my every step was evaluated. One night, while reviewing the materials I had been given, I noticed something strange. One of the pages mentioned a procedure called advanced auditing. The text said little about what it actually involved, but highlighted that it was an essential step in accessing the higher levels of clarity. The next day, I asked one of the instructors about it. He paused for a moment, as if he didn't expect the question. "Don't worry about it now," he replied, with a rehearsed smile. "You're not ready yet." The answer should have reassured me, but it did the opposite. If I wasn't ready, why was that already in my materials? Why did they want me to know this ahead of time? It was in that same week that something else happened. I was in a training session when out of nowhere, one of the participants was called out of the room. The way the instructors approached him was almost mechanical, as if it were something routine. The woman sitting next to me muttered something as he left. I shouldn't have said anything. I turned to her, confused, but she looked away quickly, as if she had said something she shouldn't. After that session, I tried to talk to her, but she avoided me. And the next day, she wasn't there. I asked one of the instructors about her, and he replied nonchalantly. She decided that this path was not for her. But the way he said it seemed wrong. There was no emotion, No trace of worry or doubt. It was as if she had disappeared and it didn't matter to anyone. I started to pay more attention to my surroundings. Small details that once seemed insignificant now jumped out at me. How the instructors always seemed to know exactly what we were thinking or feeling, even before we said anything. How some people who used to participate regularly simply disappeared without explanation. One night, as I walked to the parking lot after another long session, I had the feeling that I was being followed. I turned around, but the hallway was empty. Still, the sound of my own footsteps seemed drowned out by something else, something I couldn't identify. I got to my car, but before I got in I noticed something on the windshield. It was a folded piece of paper. I picked it up carefully, looking around to see if there was anyone around. The message was short and to the point. Be careful what you ask. My heart raced. I looked around again, but the parking lot was empty. I got into the car quickly, locking the doors and trying to control my breathing. At that moment, I realized that something was very wrong. What once seemed like an organization for personal growth now showed another face. And for the first time, I really felt afraid. But what scared me the most was that, even with this fear growing inside me, I knew that I would still come back the next day. Because, somehow, they had already ensnared me too much for me to just leave. After that night in the parking lot, my perspective changed. The message on the windshield wasn't just a warning. It was a veiled threat, and I knew it. But despite the growing fear, I kept coming back. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the feeling that if I stopped now, I would never fully understand what was happening. The training sessions began to become more intense. The instructors were no longer content with vague answers or hesitation. You need to be honest with yourself, they repeated incessantly. The pressure to open up was suffocating, and each session seemed to take something out of me, as if they were dismantling who I was piece by piece. It was in one of these sessions that everything changed. During an audit, the instructor began to ask me much more personal questions. It wasn't just about my frustrations or insecurities, but about specific moments in my life. Mistakes I made, things I was ashamed of. I hesitated. Some things were easy to share, but others were too intimate. The instructor noticed my resistance and, with a reassuring smile, said, "Don't worry, Alex. Everything you say here is confidential. We're here to help you." Against my own judgment, I began to speak. I told things I had never told anyone, stories that I had buried so deeply that I could hardly admit it to myself. With every word I said, he seemed more pleased, as if he were putting together the pieces of an invisible puzzle. When the session was over, he leaned forward slightly and said, "You're making incredible progress. But remember, Alex, the path to clarity takes courage. Trust us." But the trust was broken a few days later. During a break between trainings, one of the instructors called me in for a private conversation. He took me into a small room and closed the door behind us. On the table, there was a folder with my name on it. He opened it, revealing a dossier with detailed notes about me, things I had shared during the audit sessions. My heart raced as he flipped through the pages calmly, as if reviewing a work report. "Alex," he began in an almost friendly tone, "you've made remarkable progress, but we need to talk about some things that can be obstacles in your way." He then began to mention specific details, moments I had shared in those confidential sessions. But it was not only that. He insinuated that if I wanted to keep moving forward, I would need to demonstrate my dedication to the organization. I didn't immediately understand what he meant, but then he did something that chilled me to the bone. He pulled out one of the pages and put it in front of me. It was a note of something I had said during the audit, something deeply personal and shameful. "We're here to help you, Alex," he repeated with that rehearsed smile. "But we need your full cooperation. After all, that's what we want, isn't it? Total clarity." I felt the weight of what was happening. They weren't just gathering information. They were building an arsenal. Something they could use against me if I decided to leave, if I asked too many questions, if I didn't follow the rules. I left that room with trembling legs, my heart pounding in my chest. The message on the windshield made even more sense now. They didn't need chains or walls to keep me bound. All they needed were the secrets I had given them myself. And in that moment, I realized the real game. It wasn't about clarity or personal growth. It was about control, and I was stuck in it. After the conversation in the small room, the dossier with my name never left my mind. It was not only what was written on it, but what it represented, a tool of control, a weapon. And if they had it about me, what else did they keep? That same week, I began to notice something I had previously ignored: the folders. Whenever instructors were gathered or moved between rooms, they carried stacks of documents, as if each member had his or her own file. The mere sight of that made my stomach turn. One day during a break, I overheard two instructors talking. They were in a low tone, but something about their expression caught my attention. "He's been removed," said one, with a coldness that made me cringe. I was no longer reliable. Removed. That word echoed in my mind. It wasn't the first time I'd heard something like this, but I had never paid enough attention. Now, everything seemed to fall into place. The participants who disappeared, the audit sessions, the whispers between the instructors. There was something else going on. My chance for answers came unexpectedly. One night, I was called upon to help organize materials in a room I had never seen before. It was smaller and more stuffy than the others, with shelves crammed with folders and boxes labeled with codes. "We need you to file these documents," said one of the instructors, handing me a stack of folders. "Make sure you put them in the correct order." I was alone in the living room, surrounded by those shelves. It was impossible not to feel the weight of that moment. Each folder seemed to contain a fragment of someone, a piece of a story that they preferred to keep hidden. While organizing the folders, a name caught my attention. It was that of the woman who had disappeared after that training session. My heart raced. Without a second thought, I pulled the folder from the shelf and opened it. What I saw took my breath away. It wasn't just notes about their audit sessions, but also intimate details of their life. Bank accounts, medical history, and even personal messages that they had somehow obtained. All organized in a narrative that seemed to justify its removal. But there was more. On the last page, a note in red letters: status, unrecoverable. Action taken, final transfer. Final transfer. There was no explanation, but the weight of those words hit me like a blow. What did it mean? Where had she gone? I put the folder away quickly and continued organizing the documents, although my hands trembled. I knew I was being monitored. There were cameras in the hallways and probably in that room as well. But something inside me had changed. That night, as I drove home, the questions hammered my mind. How many other people had their secrets buried in those shelves? And more importantly, what would they do to me if they realized that I knew too much? I didn't have all the answers, but one thing was certain. The files were more than records. They were the basis of everything that kept the organization running. A system of absolute control. And now that I had peered behind a curtain, I knew I would never look at them the same way again. After finding out what was in the files, my perception of the organization changed completely. Each session, each friendly smile, seemed to mask something much darker. And it was in this state of growing distrust that I was called to participate in something they called the purification ritual. The invitation came with little explanation, like almost everything there. One of the instructors approached me at the end of a session and said, "You've been selected for the next stage. It's an important moment in your progress." I should have refused. Everything inside me said that it was a trap, but the fear of seeming suspicious was greater. If I hesitated, I knew they would notice. And after what I had seen in the archives, I could not run the risk of arousing suspicion. On the appointed day, I was taken to a different building away from the usual training rooms. The atmosphere was colder, almost clinical. A woman handed me a simple white garment and instructed me to change before entering a room they called the purification chamber. The room was small, with bright lights that seemed to penetrate the skin. In the center, there was a kind of metal capsule, with tubes connected to monitors that flashed with numbers and graphs that I didn't understand. "Lie down," said one of the instructors, pointing to the capsule. "The process is completely safe." I hesitated, but once again, I had no choice. I lay down in the capsule, while they connected the tubes to my arms and adjusted sensors on my head. The silence in the room was overwhelming. "This procedure will help flush the toxins out of your body and clear your mind," the instructor explained, with that almost hypnotic tone they always used. When the machine started working, I felt an intense heat run through my body. It wasn't exactly painful, but extremely uncomfortable. My heart raced, and my mind began to fill with disconnected images, memories, fears, moments I had buried. It was like reliving everything at once. I don't know if it was the heat, the muffled sounds of the machine, or the sensory deprivation caused by the bright light, but I began to lose track of time. After what seemed like hours, I heard the instructor's voice again. "We are almost done. Keep taking a deep breath." When the process finally ended, my legs were so weak that I needed help getting up. The instructor looked at me with a satisfied smile. "You did very well. From now on, you will start to notice the changes." But the only changes I noticed were worse than anything I could have imagined. In the following days, I had recurring nightmares, flashbacks that came out of nowhere, as if something inside me was being rewritten. They called it purification, but to me it seemed more like an experiment. Something to test how far they could go, how much control they could exert over me. And the most disturbing? When I asked other participants about the ritual, they seemed vague, as if they didn't fully remember what happened. Or, worse, as if they were afraid to speak. After the purification ritual, I felt that something had changed. Not only within me, but in the way the organization treated me. It was as if, somehow, I had advanced to a level where masks were less necessary. A few days later, I was summoned again, this time to a meeting they called a progress assessment. When I got to the room, I realized that I was different from the others. The lights were dim, almost non-existent, and the air had a metallic smell, like rust. There was only one chair in the center, with a single lamp hanging over it. One of the instructors was leaning against the wall, watching in silence. He gestured for me to sit down, and when I did, the light on me seemed more intense than necessary. "Alex," he began, with a more serious tone than I was used to, "we have reached a critical point in his path. This is the time when many fail, and failing here, it's not an option." His words made me uncomfortable. Before I could answer, another man entered the room. He looked older, with an imposing presence that filled the space. "You're here to face yourself," he said. "No distractions, no excuses. Only you and the truth." It was then that the room plunged into total darkness. The lamp was extinguished, leaving me completely blind. The silence was so absolute that I could hear my own quickening breathing and the distant sound of my heart beating. "Let's begin," said the voice of the older man, coming from somewhere in the darkness. What happened next was hard to explain. They started asking questions, but not ordinary questions. They were deep, invasive questions, which seemed to be taken directly from the audit sessions. Why do you hide what you feel? What do you fear people will find out about you? Who are you really, Alex, when no one's looking? Each question seemed to sink deep into my mind, bringing up things I didn't want to face. But it wasn't just the content of the questions that bothered me. It was their tone, as if they knew exactly where they were hitting. In the midst of this, sounds began to fill the room. Crackling, whispering, metallic noises that seemed to come from all sides. It was as if the room was alive, conspiring to disorient me. I don't know how long I was there. Minutes? Hours? Everything seemed like an eternity. But then something happened. A louder sound rang out, like the crack of a door opening. A dim light came up, and I realized I wasn't alone. There were other people in the room, all sitting in chairs just like mine, scattered around the space. Some were motionless, as if they were sleeping, but others looked at me, with expressions that oscillated between fear and resignation. "You still have a choice, Alex," said the older man, as the light on me came back on. "You can surrender to the truth or keep running away from it. But know this, not everyone can survive the dark room." When they let me out, my legs were so weak that I could barely walk. But something inside me had changed. I didn't know if it was courage or desperation, but I knew I needed to find out the truth about what was really going on there before it was too late. After the experience in the dark room, something inside me started to break. It was as if the facade that the organization had built, layer by layer, was finally cracking. The fear that had once paralyzed me now turned into an urgent need to get out of there. But getting out wasn't as simple as it seemed. The organization left no room for this. I couldn't just disappear. They knew too much about me. Every detail of my audits, every secret I had revealed, was a weapon against me. The next morning, during a break between training, I decided to test the limits. I pretended to need to leave early because of a work commitment. I waited for the instructor to just agree, but he hesitated. "You didn't mention that before, Alex," he said, with that smile that now seemed more threatening than welcoming. "Are you sure you can't reschedule? We are at an important stage in its progress." I insisted, keeping my expression neutral, trying not to show how nervous I was. Finally, he nodded, but the way he looked at me as I walked out of the building left me feeling like I was being watched. And I was. That night, while driving home, I noticed something strange. A black car with low beams seemed to follow me. I tried to dismiss it as paranoia, but the feeling persisted. When I turned right on a deserted street, the car did the same. And when I slowed down, he slowed down too. I parked in front of a convenience store, pretending to need something, but the car stopped a few feet ahead. I remained inside mine, pretending to play with my cell phone while watching in the rearview mirror. After a few minutes, the car moved on, but the weight of fear was already embedded in me. The next day, I decided to take more risks. During the training, I looked for the emergency exit, wondering if I could use it to get out without being noticed. But one of the instructors always seemed to be around, as if intuiting my intentions. My plan began to take shape when I remembered something I saw in the file room, a document with the organization's security routines. It included instructors' schedules and routes, and details about surveillance systems. I needed to access it again, but I knew I wouldn't have another chance to do it without being seen. I managed to convince one of the participants to distract the instructors during a break. While he kept them busy with questions, I sneaked into the file room. My hands trembled as I rummaged through the shelves, looking for the document I vaguely remembered. Finally, I found him. My heart raced as I read the details about the times when the hallways were less busy. But it was what was at the end of the document that paralyzed me. A section called Recovery Procedures, Detailed Protocols for Members Attempting to Leave. It included monitoring, mandatory interviews, and something called forced reintegration. There was no longer any doubt. No one left that organization without consequences. I left the room as fast as I could, trying not to attract attention. But when I returned to the training, one of the instructors called me. "Alex, can we talk?" He took me to a secluded room and stared at me for long seconds before speaking. "You seem distracted lately. Something bothering you?" I denied it, trying to sound casual, but my voice betrayed the fear. He smiled, but the smile did not reach his eyes. "Remember, Alex, we're here to help you. But you need to trust us." That night, lying in bed, I realized that I couldn't escape without them noticing. Each step would have to be meticulously planned. I was imprisoned, but not totally defeated. There was still a chance, even if small. But he knew that if he failed, there would be no turning back. They wouldn't let them. My attempt to escape began the next night. With the information I got in the archives room, I made a plan. Leave discreetly during one of the times when the surveillance was less intense and drive away without looking back. I waited until the end of the training, As everyone was leaving the rooms for the cafeteria, I blended into the crowd and headed toward the emergency exit. The corridor was empty, as the document had indicated. My heart pounded in my chest as I pushed the door, which opened with a low click. The cold night air was like a shock. He was out. It was not yet freedom, but it was a beginning. I walked quickly towards the parking lot, trying to appear calm. But when I reached my car, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. A man in a black suit was leaning against one of the poles, a few meters away. He didn't say anything. He just watched me, his arms crossed, as if he wanted to make it clear that he knew what I was doing. I got into the car, trying to ignore him, and started the engine. I drove out of the parking lot, keeping the speed low so as not to attract attention. But when I turned the first corner, I noticed headlights behind me. It was a black car, and it kept the same constant distance, as if it was waiting for me to make a mistake. My breathing was heavy, and my hands were sweating on the steering wheel. I decided to test the pursuer by turning right onto a street that led nowhere. The car did the same. I was being followed. On an impulse, I accelerated, trying to create distance. My heart felt like it was going to explode as I passed signs and streets that blended into my peripheral vision. But the black car was still behind me. Like a shadow, I couldn't escape. I arrived at a small gas station and quickly got in, stopping the car near the entrance of the store. The black car stopped on the other side of the street, but the driver did not get off. I pretended to look for something in the glove compartment, trying to think of what to do. He could not return home. It would only lead them straight to my refuge. I needed a plan, and fast. I went into the store to try to buy time, but the feeling of being watched never left me. With every move, I felt that someone was paying attention, waiting for the right moment to act. When I got back to the car, the black car was no longer there. But I knew that wasn't a relief. They were watching me, and that was a clear message. No matter where I went, they would find me. That night, I drove to a cheap motel outside of town and locked myself in my room. I tried to sleep, but every sound made me jump. The wind against the window, footsteps in the hallway. Even the sound of my own heart seemed like a threat. I knew I had crossed a line. They didn't need to tell me that. Now, it wasn't just a matter of leaving. It was a matter of surviving. And deep down, a question haunted me. How long could I escape before they caught up with me? That night, while I was locked in the motel room, I decided that running away would not be enough. I needed to understand what was happening. Why was the organization so obsessed with keeping its members? And more importantly, what were they hiding? With the information I collected in the files and the memories of the audits, I began to put the puzzle together. There were patterns in the questions they asked, in the training sessions, even in absolute control over the members. But it was in the documents that the most important pieces were. One specific detail I had read kept popping into my mind. The constant references to something called Project OT. The acronym appeared in several notes, but never with a direct explanation. I decided to search the internet, but as expected, public information was scarce. The few mentions were vague and full of speculation. That's when I remembered an old participant who had suddenly disappeared weeks ago, as well as the woman whose briefcase I had seen. He always seemed restless, as if he knew more than he said. Before he disappeared, he mentioned something about the top of the pyramid. At the time, I didn't give it importance. Now it seemed like a clue. I decided to take a risk. I found an obscure forum on the internet where former members of the organization shared stories. I created an anonymous profile and started asking questions. Most of the answers were vague, but one message caught my attention. If you've come this far, it's because you've seen something you shouldn't. Project OD is not just about higher levels. It's about total control. Be careful, because they already know where you are. My blood ran cold. The message seemed more like a warning than an explanation. I continued talking to the author of the message, who identified himself only as Eli. He revealed that Project OT was the true purpose of the organization, to create a system of absolute mental manipulation, where each member became an extension of the will of the leaders. You think you're running away, but they still have what they need to control you, Eli wrote. Your weaknesses, your secrets. You gave them all of this. I knew he was right. Every audit session, every moment in the darkroom, every test, everything had been carefully designed to disassemble and rebuild me according to what they needed. It was then that I understood the truth. The Church of Scientology was not just an organization. It was a machine fueled by the lives and minds of its members. And I was just another piece. That night, as I looked out the window of the motel room, something changed inside me. The fear was still there, but there was something else. The certainty that if I didn't do something, I would end up like the others. Lost, erased, or worse. I grabbed my backpack, put on the essentials, and set off again. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I needed to keep moving. Because now running away was not just a choice. It was the only way to survive. And even as I write this, somewhere remote, I know they're watching me. Every word, every step, every attempt to hide. They never stop. And maybe one day they will finally find me. Don't forget to like the video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any terrifying stories like this. Until next time, if you dare to come back,